The night is still. The air carries a quiet warmth, soft and steady, like the hum of a fan in a distant room. The sound does not call for attention, it simply exists, filling the empty corners of thought. You are not asked to follow a story or to remember names. You are only asked to drift through time that moves like a slow tide, touching old shores and forgotten songs. Somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, the wind has settled. The sea lies flat as glass, its surface breathing in rhythm with the moon. Far inland, valleys rest under the weight of darkness. Rivers barely move. The world seems to pause between one heartbeat and the next. And in that pause, the stories begin. Not in order, not in triumph, but as echoes carried by the air. You will pass through 4 quiet paths tonight, each unfolding without hurry. They are fragments of ancient memory shaped by silence more than speech. One begins with a musician whose song could bend the hearts of stones. Another drifts through meadows that once bloomed forever before learning the meaning of winter. A third glows with the dim light of a forge beneath the sea, where fire met patience and metal learned to breathe. And the last rises from the edge of the waves, where a goddess once touched both immortality and loss, and a child was born from that meeting, half divine, half doomed to remember. Each story rests in its own season. You may hear footsteps on marble, or the crackle of a distant torch, or a sigh that sounds like the sea pulling at the sand, but none of them will demand that you stay awake. They are not meant to teach or to warn. They exist the way stars exist, faint, constant, waiting for eyes that are willing to soften. The night deepens as you listen. The world outside fades to shadow, leaving only small sounds, the hum of your breath, the echo of imagined water, the quiet pulse of time. You may forget which story you're in or whether you've heard this one before. That's all right. These stories have no beginning and no end. They drift like dust in moonlight, returning whenever silence allows. Somewhere a lamp flickers. The flame bends, steadies, then burns low again. In its light, the lines of a map begin to appear. Faint drawings of rivers, mountains, and coastlines once known by other names. The ink trembles as if remembering its own origin. The map is not of land, but of feeling, each river a memory, each border a breath. And so, with the faint rhythm of that map beneath you, the journey opens. You move through it as gently as sleep moves through the body. The first story waits by the shore, a man and a lyre, a sound that could calm even the restless stones. The strings are ready, the air is still, and the night listens. Orpheus and Eurydice, the song of descent and the unfinished return. He was born with music in his breath. Long before words found him, before the world gave him a name, Orpheus had already discovered sound. The lyre was his first language, its strings responding as though they had been waiting for his touch. When he played, the wind bent toward him. Grass stopped swaying, and rivers changed their rhythm to follow the melody. Each note lingered in the air longer than it should, as if time itself had slowed down to listen. In that quiet world of early Greece, music was not only an art, it was a way of calling the unseen closer. When Orpheus played, even the stones seemed to lean in, their edges softened by the echo of his song. Animals forgot their wildness, trees tilted their crowns in reverence, the air itself seemed alive, shimmering with invisible threads that tied every living thing to the sound. And somewhere within that harmony, Eurydice appeared. She was not sent by a god or summoned by desire. She simply was. Her presence felt like sunlight sliding across still water, soft, certain, and impossible to hold. When she smiled, the day seemed to lengthen. When she turned away, even the sky lost its color. She walked barefoot through the fields, and Orpheus followed, carrying the weightless feeling that something within him had finally found its echo. They met in the most ordinary way. Two figures crossing paths in the whisper of a meadow. No thunder split the sky, no omen marked the moment. It was just a man with a lyre and a woman who didn't run from its sound. He played for her once, shyly at first, then with the confidence of someone who had discovered what his music had been waiting for. The tune he made that day was simple, the kind that rises slowly, holds its breath, then falls into silence. It became their song, though neither of them said so aloud. In time, the world around them began to take on that same rhythm. Morning arrived slower, evenings stretched longer, the seasons lost their edge, and everything they touched seemed gentler. They married under a tree whose leaves trembled with sound, surrounded not by grand temples or divine guests, but by the soft murmur of the earth itself. It was said that the air shimmered that evening, and for a moment, even the gods forgot their quarrels. Their days together passed like music without measure. Orpheus played, and Eurydice listened, her head resting against his shoulder, her breath matching the rhythm of his song. There were no storms, no omens, no shadows waiting at the edge of their light. Theirs was not the kind of love that burns. It was the kind that glows quietly, steady as a lantern in a calm night. But myths, like music, are built on pauses, the moment between one note and the next. And in that pause, fate often waits. Happiness in old stories is not a destination, but an interval, a fragile stretch of time before the balance of the world restores itself. One afternoon, when the sun lay low and the fields shimmered with gold, Eurydice wandered away. It was a small thing, a few steps beyond the familiar path, a turn of curiosity toward a patch of flowers. The air was soft, almost too still. A bee hovered nearby, then vanished into the tall grass. She reached down to pluck a bloom, its petals trembling under her fingers. Then from somewhere hidden came the sound, a faint hiss, sharp and final. She did not scream at first, the world simply blurred. The meadow swayed once and then stood still. The snake slipped away, leaving behind only the faint mark of its teeth and the scent of crushed flowers. Eurydice stumbled, her hand brushing the stalks as she fell. The light around her dimmed, folding inward like a curtain closing at the end of a song. When Orpheus found her, she was lying among the grass, her eyes half open, her lips curved as if she was still listening. He knelt beside her, unable to understand the silence. The lyre fell from his hands. Its strings hummed once, faintly, then went quiet. The wind moved through the meadow, slow and uncertain, as though morning had entered the air itself. For a long while, he did not move. He only watched the stillness, the way the sunlight continued to fall, indifferent, over her hair, the way the grass bent and straightened again, as if nothing had happened. Somewhere far off, a river kept flowing, unbothered by the loss. The world had not stopped, only he had. Later they would say that the song he played that night was the saddest the earth had ever heard. But perhaps it was not sadness. Perhaps it was simply the sound of love learning what it means to end. He played until his fingers bled, until the stars themselves seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his grief. And when the last note faded, what remained was silence, wide, endless, and alive with everything he could not say. In that silence, the gods listened. And somewhere deep beneath the soil, In the shadowed halls of the underworld, something began to stir. After that day, the sound of his lyre changed. It no longer rose like morning light, no longer called anyone to listen. Each note fell heavy, deep, as if sinking into the soil itself. The music no longer reached outward, it drew inward, echoing through the hollow spaces inside him. Orpheus began to wander, not with purpose, but with gravity, the kind that pulls even the strongest downward. His feet carried him beyond the fields they once walked together, beyond the olive groves and quiet villages, until the land itself seemed to fade into shadow. He did not seek the gods, he did not curse them, he only followed the rhythm of his grief, slow, persistent, and strangely clear. They say the entrance to the underworld is not a door, but a forgetting, the place where breath turns cold and sound stops belonging to the air. Orpheus stood before it and felt neither fear nor courage, only the stillness that comes when there is nothing left to lose. He lifted his lyre, the strings dull with dust, and played a single chord. The sound did not travel, it simply sank like light slipping underwater. Then without another word he stepped into the dark. The path downward was long, yet without distance. The air thickened, folded, and lost its warmth. Shadows did not move, but breathed, slow, patient, endless. Time lost its pulse. He could no longer tell whether he was walking or falling. Each step seemed to echo, but it was not his own footstep he heard. It was the echo of all who had come before him, all who had once tried and failed to return what death had claimed. When he reached the river, the ferryman did not ask for payment. The man's eyes were hollow, his expression unreadable, but something in the sound of Orpheus's music softened even that. The oar dipped quietly into black water, each stroke cutting through the reflection of a lightless sky. They crossed without words. The water whispered beneath them, repeating the same phrase over and over. All things return, all things rest. On the far bank, Cerberus lay waiting, the great hound with 3 heads, each dreaming its own dream. Orpheus played again, softly. The sound was almost nothing, a ripple, a tremor. The creature stirred, yawned, then lowered its heads onto its paws. Its breathing slowed. It slept. Orpheus passed without looking back. The underworld stretched before him, vast plains of grey dust and unmoving air. Souls drifted like mist, neither suffering nor at peace. Some recognized his song, or thought they did, and gathered close, their faint forms trembling. For a moment, the dead remembered what it felt like to be alive. The warmth of sunlight, the taste of air, the sound of laughter that belonged to a body. And then, just as quickly, they forgot again. At the deepest chamber of that silent realm, 2 figures waited. Hades sat unmoving on a throne of stone, his gaze fixed like an ancient river, frozen in place. Beside him, Persephone watched, her face pale but kind, the quiet of spring still hidden behind her eyes. Orpheus did not bow. He did not speak. He lifted his lyre and began to play. The first note was fragile, almost too faint to hear. Then another followed, and another, until the air itself began to change. The walls softened, the torches flickered. Even the endless groan of the underworld paused. The song carried no demand, no pride. It was only memory. The sound of sunlight through leaves, the warmth of skin, the rhythm of 2 hearts beating as one. Persephone's eyes glistened. Hades sat motionless, but the grip of his hand on the armrest eased. The music filled every corner of that dark domain, touching even the stones that had never known light. When it ended, there was no applause, no cry, only the quiet that follows something too pure to name. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Hades exhaled, a sound like the earth shifting in sleep. "You may have her back," he said at last, "but only under one condition. She must walk behind you, and until both of you reach the world above, you must not look back." Orpheus bowed his head. The words felt almost kind, a gift wrapped in shadow. He did not question, did not plead. He only turned and began to walk, the faint sound of footsteps following behind him like a heartbeat fading through fog. The path upward was the same, yet different. The darkness was thinner now, trembling at the edges with the suggestion of light. Each step felt heavier, filled with both hope and fear. The silence was absolute, so complete that it began to hum. He could hear her behind him, or thought he could. Sometimes her steps were clear, soft as the brushing of silk on stone. Other times they vanished entirely, swallowed by the dark. Doubt crept in like a slow chill. Was she truly there? Or had he imagined the bargain, dreamed the mercy of the dead? He wanted to speak her name, just once, to fill the silence. But he remembered the rule. Words might count as looking. The gods loved small traps. So he kept walking. The light ahead grew brighter, a faint shimmer, almost the color of dawn. Each step felt like the last. The air grew warmer, the weight of the underworld easing from his shoulders. He could almost taste wind again, real wind, with the scent of grass and water. He lifted his eyes toward that growing light and thought, just a few more steps. But the sound behind him faltered. It was small, the faintest hesitation, like a sigh caught between breaths. He stopped. The silence pressed harder, the light flickered, doubt, patient and familiar, returned. What if she's gone again? What if the gods were never listening at all? He turned. For a single heartbeat he saw her, pale, weightless, her hand reaching for him through the dim. Her eyes were not afraid, only sad and strangely calm, as if she had always known this would happen. She smiled once, softly, and then the light that shaped her dissolved, falling back into the dark. The air went still. The steps behind him were gone. The lyre slipped from his hands, striking the ground with a sound that did not echo. Above, the wind moved through the trees, the world continued, the river flowed, but deep below in that endless hush, a man stood alone, his eyes open, his hands empty, and the last note of love fading quietly into stone. The tunnel curved upward like a rib of the earth, breathing faintly as Orpheus walked. The air grew thinner, touched with a grey shimmer that hinted at light. Behind him, Eurydice's footsteps followed, soft as the whisper of silk on stone. He dared not turn, he dared not speak. The gods had been clear. One look, and she would vanish again, return to the quiet from which he had borrowed her. At first, the sound of her was steady, a faint rhythm that matched the slow pulse of his own heart. Each step was a reassurance. She was there. Alive, though faintly. Close enough for her breath to reach him, but far enough to remain untouchable. He counted her steps in his mind. 1, 2, 3. Like a prayer, whispered not to be heard. The path was long and winding. The shadows trembled and broke into fragments as the air began to change. A distant light appeared, not bright, but the pale blue of early dawn, stretched thin at the edges of the world. It was the first real light Orpheus had seen since the day she died. His hands trembled, the lyre pressed tight against his chest, as if to keep it from remembering. The silence grew heavier as the light drew nearer. Eurydice's footsteps began to fade, swallowed by the uneven rhythm of the stone. Orpheus slowed, straining to hear her, his mind caught between faith and doubt. The light flickered across his face, revealing the hollow lines carved by longing. He thought he heard her sigh, a sound so faint it could have been his own breath echoing. He stopped. The silence behind him pressed close, too deep, too complete. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. A thought rose within him, small, uninvited, and impossible to resist. What if she isn't there? He tried to keep walking, eyes fixed ahead, but the thought grew louder with each step. What if the gods had lied? What if this path was empty all along? His hand tightened around the lyre until his knuckles whitened. He told himself that trust was enough, that love could be patient. But love, he had learned, is not patient. It trembles, it questions. It turns its head when it should not. So he did. It was only a glance, the briefest turn of his face, the smallest movement of fear and need. The air behind him rippled, and there she was, caught between shadow and light, her form barely real, as if drawn by memory itself. Her eyes met his, calm and filled with an ancient knowing. She did not speak. She did not reach for him. She only looked, and in that look was forgiveness, and something gentler than grief. Then the light passed through her. Her outline softened, wavered, and folded back into the dark. The faint scent of meadow flowers, the cool trace of her breath, all vanished. The tunnel swallowed the sound, and Orpheus was alone again. He did not cry out. He did not move. He stood at the edge of the light, staring into the emptiness that had taken her for the second time. The lyre slipped from his hands and struck the stone. Its strings quivered once, then fell silent. The sound lingered, a ghost of a note that refused to fade, until even that became part of the stillness. When Orpheus stepped back into the world of the living, the dawn had fully broken. The sky was pale and vast, washed clean of stars. Birds moved through the air with quiet ease, unaware that anything had changed. The grass bent in the wind, glistening with dew. Everything seemed untouched, as if the underworld and its bargains had been nothing more than a dream. He walked among the hills without direction. The world had sound again, the rustle of leaves, the hum of insects, the distant bark of a dog, but it all felt muted, far away. His ears, once filled with song, now heard only the space between things. He carried his lyre, though he did not play it. The strings were whole, yet every note it could make belonged to her. In time, people began to whisper about him, the man who had walked into the land of the dead and returned empty-handed. They said his eyes held the reflection of another world, and that even his silence carried music. He wandered from village to village, never staying long. When he played, the sound was slow and weightless, like breath leaving the body. It did not charm or dazzle anymore, it simply lingered, like the echo of something that once mattered. Seasons turned, the grass grew tall, withered, and grew again. He played less often, until even the lyre seemed to forget its purpose. The songs that had once swayed trees and tamed beasts now drifted only to the edge of hearing. Quiet laments meant for no one. He no longer sought audiences. He no longer sought anything. The music became a way to speak to the spaces she had left behind. They say he lived for many years like that, between light and silence, never fully awake, never fully gone. The gods did not trouble him, the mortals did not understand him. He existed as an echo, the sound of loss given shape. One evening, as the sun sank low and the hills turned to bronze, he sat beside a stream. The water glimmered faintly, catching pieces of the sky. He lifted his lyre one last time. The melody he played was almost nothing, a thread of sound woven through the hum of insects, the sigh of wind, the breath of twilight. It rose, circled once in the air, then dissolved, leaving only stillness behind. The night came quietly. The stars appeared one by one, as if answering some forgotten rhythm. Orpheus closed his eyes and listened to the silence. It was full, not empty, not cruel, just vast and unending. Somewhere, far beyond sound, he thought he heard her footsteps again, light, distant, moving through the dark. And then the world went still. His lyre rested beside him, its strings glowing faintly in the moonlight. When the wind passed through, it sang for him, not loud, not sad, just steady, like the earth breathing in its sleep. The story ends there, or maybe it doesn't. Perhaps his song continues, stretched thin across the air, too soft for the living to hear. Perhaps beneath the ground, where silence blooms like stone flowers, she listens still. Persephone, the hinge of the seasons. Before there was the idea of cold, before time was divided into seasons, the world existed in one endless spring. The fields were always green, the trees always in bloom. Rivers flowed softly under skies that never turned grey. Nothing withered, nothing slept. The earth breathed in a slow and steady rhythm, content in its own perfection. In that everlasting morning, Persephone walked. Wherever she stepped, grass rose higher. Wherever her shadow touched, flowers opened their petals wider. The air carried the scent of youth, sweet, fleeting, and without memory. Bees followed her like small golden prayers. Even the light itself seemed to bend toward her, unsure whether it was guiding her or being guided. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and together they kept the world awake. Demeter shaped the fruit, coaxed the seeds to grow, and taught the soil to give without limit. Persephone was the color in those gifts, the shimmer of dew, the hum that made blossoms tremble. Mother and daughter moved as one, creation and renewal, earth and its heartbeat. There was no need for rest. The world, untouched by decay, did not yet understand balance. The sky remained a gentle gold, the air filled with the sound of rivers and the slow turning of the earth's pulse. Every dawn was the same, perfect, patient, infinite. To mortals it might have seemed like paradise, but even paradise, when it never ends, begins to grow tired of itself. Deep beneath that light, another kingdom stirred. Far below the roots of trees and the whisper of wind, Hades ruled the underworld, a realm of silence, order, and waiting. He was not cruel as mortals believed, only lonely. His halls were carved from stone and shadow. The souls that drifted through them spoke softly, their voices barely touching the air before dissolving. To them, time was no longer a river, but an ocean without current. Hades had seen everything that died and everything that endured. Yet nothing in his vast dominion moved him until he saw her. Persephone, the girl of endless spring. It was said that he caught sight of her by chance, though in stories such things are never truly by chance. She was gathering lilies by a stream, her laughter carried by the wind, and for a moment even the still waters of the underworld quivered. To Hades, she was not merely beautiful. She was unbearable, light made flesh, a rhythm that did not belong to silence. He watched her through the veil between worlds, where roots became his ceiling, and cracks of sunlight fell like dreams he could not touch. The longer he watched, the more he understood that his own realm was not complete. The dead had peace, yes, but no renewal. Without her, even the silence lacked purpose. Above, the world continued in its gentle perfection. Persephone wandered further than usual that day, led by curiosity more than intent. The meadows stretched endlessly, a sea of white narcissus and pale gold petals swaying in the quiet wind. She hummed to herself, a melody older than language, the song of a world that had never known sorrow. Then among the flowers she saw it, one bloom unlike the rest. It stood alone, tall and luminous, its petals shimmering as if made of moonlight caught in water. Something in it felt wrong, too still, too perfect, yet irresistible. She reached toward it, her fingers brushing the edge of its petals. The ground trembled beneath her feet. The sound came first, a deep, rolling crack like the earth sighing after holding its breath too long. Then the soil split apart. From the fissure rose a chariot of black and gold, its wheels wreathed in shadow, its horses snorting steam that smelled faintly of iron and rain. Hades stood at its helm, his crown gleaming with the dull light of the underworld sun. His eyes met hers, dark, unblinking, filled with the weight of eternity. For a moment, the world seemed to hesitate. The flowers stopped swaying, the wind stopped moving. Then, with a single motion, Hades reached for her hand. His touch was not violent, but absolute. The air folded around them, and the earth closed as if swallowing a secret. The meadows fell silent again, save for the faint echo of hooves fading into the deep. When the dust settled, only the broken stem of the narcissus remained, a trace of what had been. The sun still shone, but the air felt thinner, quieter, as though something vital had been taken from it. Demeter felt it first. The bond between mother and daughter was not bound by sight or sound. It lived in the pulse of the world itself. She was tending a field when her heart stuttered, one heartbeat missing, one breath gone still. She called Persephone's name, softly at first, then louder. The air did not answer. Days passed, though in that world of endless light, days meant little. Demeter searched every grove, every valley, every riverbed. She asked the winds if they had seen her daughter, the birds if they had heard her laughter. But all gave the same answer: silence. Even the soil beneath her fingers felt colder, as if the warmth had withdrawn. The gods on Olympus watched but did not speak. Zeus, father to both Hades and Persephone, knew what had happened and said nothing. Some say he feared imbalance, that too much life without death would exhaust the world. Others say he merely waited to see what would unfold. As Demeter wandered, the world began to change. Crops no longer grew at her command. The green of the fields dulled, the flowers hesitated before blooming. A quiet sadness spread through the air, the kind that doesn't shout but lingers in the bones of things. For the first time, the earth began to rest, unwillingly, painfully, but necessarily. And below, in the dim kingdom of stone, Persephone opened her eyes. The air was cool, thick with stillness. She heard the faint rustle of unseen wings, the soft echo of her own breath. Around her, the walls glowed faintly with veins of silver and fire. Hades stood nearby, silent as the shadows that obeyed him. "You are safe here," he said, though his voice carried no triumph, only certainty. Persephone did not answer. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dark, to the strange beauty of this quiet place where nothing bloomed and nothing died. She did not cry. She did not rage, she only listened, to the stillness, to the faint hum of rivers flowing beneath the stone, to the heartbeat of a world she had never known. Somewhere far above, the first leaf began to fall. The endless spring had ended. The world had taken its first breath of winter. It happened on a morning so quiet that even the dew seemed unwilling to fall. The air was soft, filled with the hum of bees and the faint murmur of a distant stream. Persephone wandered through the meadow, her hands brushing against the tall stems of flowers. The world was still in its endless spring, untouched by the idea of loss. Then among the sea of color she saw it, a flower whiter than snow, gleaming faintly as if it carried its own light. She knelt to touch it. The moment her fingers met the petals, the ground trembled. A thin crack split the earth, widening with the sound of stone breaking open. The song of the meadow fell silent. From the darkness beneath, a chariot of black and gold surged upward, pulled by horses whose breath steamed like smoke. The scent of flowers turned sharp, metallic. At its helm stood Hades. His face was pale as ash, his eyes steady as midnight. He said nothing, for words are useless between gods. With one hand he reached for Persephone, not roughly, but with the inevitability of something long decided. The air folded around them, and in a blink they were gone. The chariot plunged back into the earth, and the crack closed behind them, as if it had never been. For a long moment the world held its breath. The field lay still. The flower Persephone had touched wilted, its stem curling toward the wound that had sealed itself. A single petal drifted through the air before falling into the grass, where the dew began to dry. Far away, Demeter felt it, the absence, the sudden silence in the pulse of the living world. A mother's knowing that needs no proof. She looked to the fields, but the wind no longer carried her daughter's laughter. The soil beneath her feet felt heavier, colder. She began to search, through orchards, over hills, across rivers that no longer sang. She called her daughter's name into the wind, but the wind gave no answer. The animals watched her from the distance, their movements slow, uncertain. The sun burned high and unchanging, yet the air seemed dimmer somehow, as if a thin veil had fallen across the light. Everywhere she walked, life hesitated. Seeds remained still, as if afraid to wake. The color drained from the leaves. Fruit shriveled before it could ripen. The soil that once pulsed with promise now lay quiet under her touch. The goddess of harvest, once a giver of abundance, began to feel the first shape of grief. And with her grief, the world learned how to stop. The days blended together, though in a place without seasons, time had little meaning. Demeter wandered further, her golden robes gathering dust, her torches burning low. She questioned the rivers, the nymphs, the mountains. None had seen the girl with the light in her hair. Only the earth itself seemed to know, and it would not speak. When the sun sank, she did not rest. She walked through villages where the fields had already begun to fail. The people, unaware of the gods' sorrow, prayed for rain that would not come. They left offerings at their shrines, but their hands trembled. They sensed what they could not name, that something in the order of things had shifted. Nights grew longer, the wind turned cold. The silence that followed was not simple absence, but a deep, waiting quiet, like the breath drawn before sleep. It spread through the valleys, through the forests, through the very bones of the land. Animals moved slower. Rivers carried less sound. The earth began to dim, not from darkness, but from weariness. Demeter's search led her to the highest mountain, where the air was thin and still. From there, she looked down upon the silent fields and understood. The world was fading with her grief. Nothing grew, nothing answered. It was the first rest the earth had ever known. The first pause in the endless cycle of giving. The first winter, though the word had not yet been spoken. In the underworld, Persephone sat among shadows. The air was cool and thick, like a breath held too long. The walls glimmered faintly with veins of silver, and rivers of memory flowed quietly beneath the stone. Hades stood near, distant yet constant, watching her without demand. He had not taken her to punish, nor to possess, but to fill the emptiness of a realm where nothing changed. Yet even he could not escape the silence her absence had left above. In her stillness, he saw the reflection of his own solitude. Persephone did not weep. She listened. The air here was not dead, it was merely patient. Every whisper, every echo carried the trace of lives once lived, of songs once sung. She began to understand that death was not an end, only a long quietness. Still her heart longed for warmth, for color, for the touch of her mother's hands in the light. Above, Demeter's sorrow grew into fury. She struck the earth with her staff, and the ground trembled. "If I cannot find her," she said to the sky, "then nothing shall grow." The gods heard her, but none dared to intervene. Zeus, her brother, turned his face away. The fields turned grey, the orchards bare. The mortals began to suffer. Their stores emptied, their animals weakened. They built fires against the cold and waited for the sun to return. They told stories to explain what they did not understand. That the goddess had left them, that the land was sleeping, that something divine had gone missing. And so the first winter settled upon the world. It was not death, only stillness, the earth curling inward, keeping its warmth deep within, saving it for a time when grief would ease. Demeter wandered on, her torches flickering in the endless dusk. The earth lay beneath her like a sleeping child, breathing faintly. The rivers slowed, the air turned pale, and the world, for the first time, learned the art of waiting. It was said that the gods above fell silent too. Even Apollo dimmed his chariot for a while. No feasts were held on Olympus, no laughter echoed through its halls. All creation seemed to pause, suspended in that fragile space between loss and hope. And in the stillness, beneath layers of earth and memory, Persephone's faint voice began to rise. Not in words, but in the quiet rhythm of the world's heart. For though she had vanished, she was not gone. The seeds buried deep in the cold soil still held her promise. In their silent cause, life waited. And above, her mother, though broken, continued to walk, one foot after another, carrying the torch through the darkness. It would be a long winter, but within that silence, something new was being born. The understanding that even absence has its own kind of grace, and that every sleep, no matter how deep, waits for the sound of return. When the silence had grown too deep for the gods to ignore, Zeus finally looked down from the heights of Olympus. The earth lay bare beneath him, the rivers slowed, the fields turned to dust, the prayers of mortals rising like smoke that had forgotten how to fade. He knew the source of the stillness, he had known it all along. But the silence of gods can last a long time, and this one had stretched too far. He called for Hermes, the swift one, the only god whose steps could cross both sunlight and shadow. "Go," he said, "and bring the girl back. The earth sleeps, and the world must wake." Hermes descended through the cold air, his sandals whispering over the frost that now covered the meadows of men. Down he went, past the cracks of the world, past rivers that remembered every sorrow ever spoken, until he reached the halls of Hades. The realm was quiet, but not cruel. The air shimmered faintly with Persephone's presence. She sat beside Hades, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze soft but unreadable. Around her feet, small white flowers had begun to bloom, fragile ghosts of life, glowing gently against the dark stone. When Hermes spoke, his voice carried the sound of wind moving through branches long forgotten. The world above waits for her. Demeter will not let it breathe until her daughter returns. Hades stood, his shadow long and still. His face revealed nothing, but the silence around him changed, heavier, as though the walls themselves were reluctant to let her go. He turned toward Persephone, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. "If you wish to return," he said, "you may. But know that the world you left is not the same, and neither are you." Persephone nodded, though her eyes lingered on the faint flowers she had coaxed from the stone. She felt their fragile roots under her fingertips, the strange tenderness of life in a place where none should grow. She did not answer with words. Instead, she stood, and the air stirred as she moved. Before she left, Hades offered her a small bowl, a fruit, split open, its seeds glistening like rubies. "Eat," he said quietly, "so that the journey will not weaken you." It was meant as kindness, perhaps even love, but the laws of the underworld are old, and every act carries its price. She took 6 seeds. Their sweetness lingered on her tongue, deep and heavy as the night itself. Hermes did not speak, though he knew what it meant. When one eats of the food of the dead, one belongs to that realm forever in part. And so it was decided, not by decree but by nature itself, that Persephone would live between 2 worlds. 6 months above, where the wind carried the scent of wheat and the hum of bees. 6 months below, where memory and silence kept her name alive. When she rose again, the ground broke open in gentle welcome. Light poured through the cracks like the first breath of the world. Demeter was already there, her torches burning with wild joy. She ran to her daughter, and when they met, the embrace seemed to wake the earth. Grass grew beneath their feet. Flowers bloomed before the tears could fall. The air turned warm. Birds began to sing again, testing their wings against the light. Spring had returned. For days the world rejoiced. The fields swelled with color, rivers burst from their frozen beds, and mortals offered thanks to the gods they had cursed only weeks before. Demeter smiled again, though her smile carried the quiet knowledge of loss remembered. She no longer demanded permanence. She had learned that even joy must bend to rhythm. But joy, like the seasons, must yield. When the 6th month came, Hermes returned once more. His eyes were kind, but his message was final. "It is time," he said. The light dimmed, the warmth faded from the air. Demeter's hands trembled, though she did not protest. Persephone looked toward the horizon, where the last of the sun stretched across the fields, and understood that this leaving was not punishment. It was part of the breath that kept the world alive. She turned to her mother. "I will come back," she said softly. Demeter nodded. "And I will wait." Then the earth opened again, gently this time. No roar, no trembling. The soil parted like water, and Persephone descended once more. Her torch flickered in the growing dusk. Above, the leaves began to brown and curl, the air cooled, and the first frost whispered across the fields. Autumn had come. Below, Hades waited, but no longer as captor. His realm had changed under her touch. The caverns now glowed faintly with her light. The air was warmer, the shadows softer. She walked through the underworld not as a prisoner, but as its queen, the one who carried both life and death in her hands. The spirits of the dead bowed as she passed. To them she was no longer just the girl who had once been taken, but the bridge between two worlds, a promise that nothing truly ends. When she reached her throne, she looked to Hades and said, "I have seen the flowers bloom again. The world will sleep now, but it will wake. Everything must rest before it can return." He said nothing, but his gaze softened. And for the first time, the underworld felt less like absence and more like balance. Above them, Demeter tended the quiet earth. She no longer raged against the cold. Instead, she walked among the bare fields, touching the soil with patient care. "Rest," she whispered to the seeds buried beneath. "Sleep well. She will come back." And so the seasons learned their rhythm. Spring opened the earth, summer filled it, autumn folded it, and winter let it rest. The pattern was no longer tragedy, but truth, a breathing of the world itself. Mortals began to understand. They saw their own lives mirrored in the turning of the year, growth, fullness, decline, and renewal. They built rituals for the planting and the harvest, sang songs of waiting and return, and learned that every ending carried the shape of a beginning. Persephone's journey had become the pulse of time. Each year, her ascent brought life, and her descent gave rest. The gods no longer interfered, for even Olympus must obey the rhythm that keeps creation alive. In spring, her laughter was in the rivers. In summer, her steps in the tall grass. In autumn, her shadow lingered among the falling leaves. And in winter, her silence wrapped the world in calm. Demeter no longer wept. She watched, knowing that love, even divine love, must learn to let go, to trust in the return. For every loss is not a disappearance, but a turning. Every descent is only a path toward another rise. And so the earth breathed again, steady and eternal, held between two truths: that life needs stillness, and that every stillness waits for the sound of life's return. Hephaestus, the forge, the throne, and the living creations. Far from the golden halls of Olympus, beyond the laughter, the feasts, and the echo of lyres, there was another kind of light. It was not the blinding glow of the sun or the divine shimmer of marble. It was the red, steady pulse of fire. Quiet, patient, alive. Deep inside the mountain, that fire burned without spectacle. It did not roar, it hummed, the way a heart hums beneath the ribs, keeping time without asking to be heard. The cave around it breathed in rhythm, slow drafts of heat rising, curling, and fading into dark air. There, where even the gods seldom looked, lived Hephaestus. He was not beautiful, not in the way Olympus defined beauty, symmetry, gold, perfection, without flaw. His gait was uneven, his shoulders heavy from the weight of years spent bending toward the anvil. His face carried no divine glow, only the calm focus of someone who had stopped expecting the world to notice him. Yet when he lifted the hammer, the air itself seemed to wait. The first strike rang out, not loud but true. Sparks flared like short-lived stars, and in that dim chamber, creation began again. Hephaestus worked alone. He preferred it that way. Words had never been his language. His voice belonged to the fire, his thoughts to the rhythm of iron cooling underwater. Each clang was a syllable, each breath of the bellows a pause between ideas. Where other gods debated and schemed, he shaped silence into form. From that silence came wonders, cups that never cracked, armor that never dented, jewels whose light did not fade. Every creation bore the mark of stillness, precise, measured, balanced. Hephaestus did not seek praise. When the work was done, he simply looked at it for a long time, the way one looks at something fragile before sending it out into the world. He wanted only one thing from his craft, that it might last longer than he would, the fire reflected in his eyes, steady and unwavering. Around him, the cave filled with the faint smell of metal and salt, the scent of something both alive and eternal. His tools lay in perfect order, the hammer worn smooth, the tongs blackened at the tips, the anvil marked by centuries of thought turned tangible. Hephaestus had not always lived in shadow. Once, long ago, he had been cast into the sea, a child hurled from heaven for being imperfect. His mother, ashamed of his crooked legs and uneven form, had thrown him from the high clouds, and he had fallen for a day and a night before the ocean caught him. The gods forgot, but the waves remembered. They carried him gently into the arms of Thetis, the sea goddess who would one day bear Achilles. She and the nymph Eurydice took pity on the broken child and hid him deep beneath the waves. There, among coral pillars and drifting light, the exiled god grew. The sea became his teacher. He learned the patience of tides, the endurance of salt, the slow shaping of stone by water. And from the molten veins of underwater volcanoes, he discovered the secret of flame that could burn even beneath the waves. When he struck his first spark in that dark ocean cavern, it was not loud. It was delicate, careful, a whisper against oblivion. The fire caught, reflected in the smooth shells and pearls around him. It was not the wild fire of Zeus's thunderbolts or the violent fire of war. It was the fire that stays, the one that shapes, the one that builds. Years passed, and the forgotten god became the master of craft. The sea nymphs brought him fragments from shipwrecks, twisted bronze, shattered gold, rusted swords, and he melted them into new forms. From the wreckage of mortals, he created beauty. Goblets lined with coral, necklaces woven from silver and shell, mechanisms that moved like living creatures. When he worked, even the sea stilled to listen. The hammer's rhythm echoed through the deep, a heartbeat beneath the waves. Thetis watched him grow, saw the fire take root in him. "You are not broken," she once said. "You are tempered." But Hephaestus knew the difference between kindness and belonging. The gods above had never asked for him, and he had learned not to wait for their call. So he built instead not temples or statues, but endurance. The forge became his world, his pulse, It was there that he learned the meaning of permanence, not in perfection, but in persistence. The metals that resisted most were the ones he loved best. Iron that refused to bend. Bronze that cracked and had to be melted again. Every failure was another lesson in patience. Sometimes, when the fire dimmed and the smoke thinned to blue, he would sit beside the embers and listen to the sound of the mountain. It was a slow breathing, a reminder that even the earth had its own rhythm of labor. "You and I," he murmured once to the rock, "we both hold what others discard." He smiled faintly, not bitterly. The gods above celebrated beauty, but beauty fades. Hephaestus had chosen something else, durability, the quiet dignity of what endures. His hands were scarred, the skin thickened by centuries of heat. Each mark was a story, each callus a memory of creation. When he shaped metal, he could feel it answer, softening beneath his hammer like a sigh. He did not dominate the material, he negotiated with it. That was his secret. He did not force the fire. He listened. At times, small automatons, tiny bronze figures shaped by his hands, would stir to life in the corners of the workshop. They moved awkwardly, but with purpose. One carried tools, another fetched oil. A third simply followed the rhythm of the hammer as if enchanted by its constancy. Hephaestus did not marvel at them. To him, they were not miracles. They were companions, echoes of motion that filled the silence between one creation and the next. Outside, the world of the gods carried on without noticing the one who kept its foundation intact. Their palaces stood on beams forged by his hands, their weapons gleamed with his polish, their crowns shimmered with the light of his skill. Yet his name was rarely spoken in their feasts. That too no longer troubled him. There is a kind of peace that comes when one accepts invisibility, the peace of a craftsman whose reward is not applause, but the sound of something well made, cooling into permanence. Sometimes, when the flame flickered low, Hephaestus would remember the sky, not with longing, but with a distant curiosity, the way one remembers a place from a dream. He imagined the marble halls, the gods laughing, the clouds glowing gold, and then he looked back to his forge, the slow red heart of his world, and thought, they have light, but they do not have warmth. And so he stayed, shaping, mending, creating. Each strike of the hammer was both memory and defiance. Each finished piece a quiet declaration that what is flawed may still endure, that what is discarded may still shine. In the steady glow of the forge, the god of fire did not chase perfection. He built permanence. And though Olympus had forgotten him, the world would never again forget the echo of his hammer. From the quiet forge that glowed beneath the mountain, there came a creation unlike any other. It began not with a spark, but with a thought, slow, deliberate, heavy as molten gold. For years Hephaestus had forged tools and armor for others, weapons to crown their wars, adornments to dress their pride. But this time he worked for himself. He shaped gold as though it were silk, folding light into metal until it gleamed with a warmth that felt alive. The throne grew under his hands, a seat of impossible beauty, every curve polished, every hinge hidden, every edge softened, until it looked less like a chair and more like a living thing. No mortal would have understood what it truly was. Even the gods, had they seen it, would have mistaken it for a gift. It was, and yet it was also a memory, a quiet, shining act of revenge. For in its delicate design lay a secret. Beneath the grace of its golden arms, mechanisms waited, so fine and silent that even the air did not notice their tension. When touched, the throne would close upon itself, not with cruelty, but with the calm precision of justice. It was a trap that punished without rage, a prison born not of fire, but of silence. Hephaestus never spoke of his purpose, he only worked. The hammer's rhythm echoed through the cavern, soft but steady, like a pulse returning after long sleep. When the throne was finished, it glowed with its own light. Even the flames seemed to dim in respect. He sent it to Olympus, not as a curse, but as an offering. The gods, who had long forgotten the exiled smith, received it with admiration. And Hera, queen of heaven and mother of his exile, could not resist. The day she sat upon it, Olympus fell silent. The throne shimmered beneath her, and then, With a quiet sigh as though fulfilling its design, the golden frame curved inward. The arms folded gently around her body, the back closed, and the divine queen found herself bound not by chains, but by beauty. Her voice, so used to commanding, trembled with fury. The other gods came running. They tried strength first. Ares struck with his spear, Athena calculated. Apollo sang incantations of light. None could move it. The throne remained still, its gold untouched, its perfection unbroken. Every attempt to destroy it only made its beauty more terrible. And so the laughter of Olympus ceased. The mountain that had once echoed with arrogance learned for the first time the weight of stillness, the kind that Hephaestus had lived with all his life. While above the clouds chaos unfolded, the god below worked on. His forge glowed brighter than ever. He did not need to see the result of his gift, he already knew. The mountain carried the vibrations of the god's struggle, and the sound came to him like distant thunder, fading beneath the rhythm of his hammer. But vengeance, even when just, is never his only language. Hephaestus was not made for cruelty. He was made for creation. When the throne was done and the gods began to whisper his name again, half in awe, half in fear, he turned his fire toward something gentler, something stranger. If beauty could imprison, perhaps craft could set free. He began to make companions. They were not born of flesh or will, but of gold, the same gold that once built a cage, now shaped into grace. Their forms were human, but their silence was divine. Each one moved with a quiet precision, their gestures soft, their steps careful. When they bowed, the air shifted as if in reverence. Hephaestus gave them no hearts, but he gave them balance. He gave them hands that could carry tools, feet that could walk without sound, and faces that reflected the calm of their maker. They did not tire, they did not question. They simply existed, extensions of his solitude shaped in the image of stillness itself. In the forge, their bodies caught the red light of the fire and shone like molten dawn. Sometimes, when the god worked deep into the night, they moved around him, adjusting the bellows, carrying cooled metal, wiping the sweat from his brow. The sound of their steps was barely more than a whisper. Soft taps against the stone floor, like rain falling in slow rhythm. To any observer, it might have seemed eerie. These golden figures, neither alive nor dead, serving a god who no longer sought company. But to Hephaestus, they were not ghosts or slaves, they were peace. They were what he could trust, the unbroken repetition of order, the perfect echo of intent. It was said that the first of them could even speak. Their voices were faint, like wind over a harp string, but when they addressed him, it was always with the same phrase. "What shall we make next?" He never answered aloud. The hammer answered for him. Some nights, when the fire dimmed and the forge sank into silence, the figures would stand still in the half-light, their golden faces turned toward their creator, as if waiting. Hephaestus would rest his hands on the anvil, listening to the mountain breathe. The warmth of the metal slowly faded beneath his palms. He would think of the world above, the bright halls, the laughter, the cruel ease with which beauty judged imperfection. Then he would look to his golden servants, whose perfection contained no vanity, whose obedience contained no fear, and feel the faintest trace of comfort. He had built the impossible, beings without pride, without envy, without pain. And yet, even in their flawless silence, he felt the echo of his own solitude reflected back at him. For what is creation, if not a way to make the emptiness visible? Outside, the gods began to speak of him again, not as the lame one or the forgotten one, but as the artisan who could bind divinity itself. Zeus sent messengers to the depths, promising gifts, honors, forgiveness. But Hephaestus did not come. He had his fire, his work, and his companions. The world above could wait. It was only when Dionysus, the god of wine and laughter, descended to the mountain with a cup of nectar that something shifted. Unlike the others, Dionysus did not plead or threaten. He drank, laughed, and placed another cup into Hephaestus's scarred hands. "You've outdone us all," he said gently. "Now come back, brother. Olympus is less beautiful without you." Hephaestus looked at him for a long time, then at the golden figures standing still behind him. They had no faces, yet in the soft glow of the forge they seemed almost human, waiting for a word that would never come. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, like embers speaking through smoke. "I built them to keep me company, but they cannot feel, and perhaps that is the mercy they have, to exist without knowing loneliness." Dionysus said nothing. The fire flickered between them, red and gold, the color of memory. That night, Hephaestus left his forge and returned to the mountain above, but the golden figures remained. Silent guardians of the workshop, moving slowly through the dark, polishing the tools, tending the flames. Their steps continued long after their maker was gone, steady as time itself. And in that endless rhythm, the quiet ringing of metal, the echo of footsteps against stone, the world heard, for the first time, the beginning of another kind of life. The dream of machines, the whisper of endurance, the heartbeat of solitude made eternal. The forge was quiet again. After the golden figures had faded into their endless rhythm, and Olympus had long ceased to tremble from Hera's throne, Hephaestus returned to the work that had always waited for him, the work that asked for nothing but time. The mountain was dark above, but within the cavern the light pulsed like a heartbeat. It wasn't the wild blaze of destruction, but the steady, measured glow of endurance. The air shimmered with heat and silence, both alive, both patient. Hephaestus stood by the anvil, his hands blackened with soot, his breath matching the rhythm of the bellows. To any mortal, it would have looked like routine. But to the god who had known both exile and return, it was prayer, the only kind he still believed in. He had no use for vengeance now. The gods had already learned what his silence could do. What remained was the fire itself, not as punishment, but as purpose. So he began again. This time the task came not from his own will, but from another's command. Zeus had spoken, his voice sharp as lightning, carrying through the mountain stone. "Forge chains," he said, "for the Titan who dared to steal fire from heaven." The irony was almost tender. The god of fire asked to bind the one who had given it to mankind. Hephaestus did not question. The forge did not question him. He gathered the metals that could not break, the ores that whispered of eternity. With slow precision, he melted, mixed, and shaped them into links, not sharp or cruel, but seamless and eternal. They shone like starlight on stone, beautiful and merciless at once. Every strike of the hammer echoed through the cavern, low and steady. The sparks rose and vanished in quiet arcs like fleeting thoughts. Each chain was a sentence, each link a memory. When he was done, the chains gleamed with their own light. They did not rattle, they simply existed, patient as time itself. And when the gods came to collect them, Hephaestus handed them over without a word. Later, he would walk alone through the forge, imagining what it must have been like for Prometheus, to stand on the cold cliff of the Caucasus, bound by the very fire he once carried to humankind. There was a strange kinship between them. Both had defied the order of Olympus, both had paid for giving light to others. But Hephaestus had learned the cost of rebellion. He knew now that the world was not changed by anger. It was shaped by endurance. And so he turned back to his forge. Years passed, or centuries. Gods do not measure time as mortals do. The mountain never cooled. The fire burned, gentle and endless. One day the sea goddess Thetis entered his workshop, her steps soft against the stone. She had once saved him when he was cast from heaven, carrying his broken body into the sea and healing him among coral and tide. Now she came again, but this time with a request. "My son," she said, "is going to war. Make him armor that the world will remember." Hephaestus looked up. The firelight caught the curve of her sorrow. Thetis's eyes, bright with immortal calm, carried the same ache he knew too well, the knowledge that love could not protect what fate had already claimed. He said nothing. Words had long since failed him. Instead, he lifted his hammer. For 9 nights the forge burned brighter than the stars above Olympus. Even the gods leaned closer, feeling the air tremble with the rhythm of creation. The golden figures moved in silence, feeding the fire, turning the bellows, cooling the metal. Each motion was precise, each sound deliberate. Hephaestus worked slowly, breathing with the fire. Every beat of the bellows was a heartbeat. Every strike of the hammer was a breath. The cave glowed like the inside of a sun. He forged not only with strength but with memory. The memory of falling, of rising, of being forgotten and found again. He poured all of it into the metal. When he shaped the breastplate, it reflected not victory, but resilience. When he molded the helmet, it caught the faint sound of waves, so that the one who wore it might still remember his mother's voice. And when he came to the shield, he paused. A shield, he thought, is not only for protection. It is the mirror of the world. He began to carve it not with words but with images, not with tools but with patience. The surface bloomed with scenes of life and loss, of work and rest, of men building and breaking, of fields turning gold, of stars moving across black sky. The shield held everything, the cities of mortals, the peace of fields, the quiet pulse of existence itself. It was the world, condensed into metal, a reminder that war, too, was only part of the cycle. When the work was done, he placed the armor on a stone slab. It shone with a light that was not fire, not gold, but something between, the glow of meaning. Thetis wept softly as she looked upon it. She understood what Hephaestus had done. He had not made armor for victory. He had made it for remembrance. She bowed her head in gratitude, and when she left, carrying the gift for her son, the forge fell silent once more. Hephaestus stood before the dying fire, watching the embers fade. The golden figures had stopped moving. The air cooled. For a moment, the world felt almost still. He rested his hammer on the anvil and looked at his hands. They were scarred, blackened, and trembling slightly from the weight of all they had built. He thought of the chains that bound a Titan. He thought of the armor that would soon face the arrows of Troy. He thought of how every creation, no matter how perfect, carried the shadow of its own destruction. And yet, he did not despair. Because this was the rhythm he understood: forge and cool, rise and fall, make and unmake. Fire consumes, but it also renews. To destroy is to clear a path. To burn is to temper. As the night deepened, he stoked the fire once more. The bellows sighed and the flames breathed again. Steady, patient, eternal. The metal sang faintly as if remembering all the hands that had shaped it. Hephaestus closed his eyes. The sound was soft, almost human. There was no applause in the forge, no praise, no divine celebration. Only the quiet recognition that beauty does not need to shout to exist. The true art of creation was not glory, but repetition. The endless practice of making something endure. And so he worked, as he always had, alone, surrounded by light and silence. The mountain outside slept beneath the stars. Deep within, the forge exhaled in slow rhythm, a breath of fire that would never die. And if one listened closely, through the layers of stone and heat, one could almost hear the whisper that guided his hand. Everything that lasts is born from patience. Everything that shines is made from suffering. And even gods must learn to create in silence. Thetis, Peleus, and the promise that led to Achilles. Morning stretched across the sea like polished glass. The waves were slow, as if the world itself hesitated before the first movement of destiny. Thetis stood at the edge of the water, her reflection merging with the pale horizon. She was born of the sea, her form soft and shifting like the light that danced upon it. To her, the sound of the tide was older than words, the same sound that had cradled her since before memory began. But today that sound carried something unfamiliar. A call that was not from the ocean but from Olympus. The will of the gods had spoken. She, a daughter of the waves, was to marry a mortal man. Not by choice, not by love, but by decree. His name was Peleus, a man of courage and discipline, descended from the line of Zeus, yet bound by the limits of flesh. The prophecy had decided their fates long before they met. The child born of their union would surpass all his forebears, mortal or divine. The gods, fearing the rise of another power, chose to give Thetis to a man whose blood would weaken that prophecy. And so beneath the shimmer of a tranquil dawn, the sea prepared to give away its daughter. The wedding took place on a stretch of sand that glowed as if lit from within. The sun leaned low above the horizon, touching the waves with gold. From the heights of Olympus, the gods descended, radiant, flawless, and heavy with their own vanity. They arrived in laughter and light, bringing gifts that glittered but carried the scent of foreboding. Even joy in the realm of immortals often hides a warning. The nymphs sang as they braided Thetis's hair with pearls, their voices mingling with the rhythm of the surf. Each note shimmered and faded, like foam dissolving on the shore. The goddess of the sea stood still, her gaze fixed not on her groom, but on the horizon. Somewhere deep within her, the water stirred uneasily. Peleus approached her without hesitation. His movements were human, firm, deliberate, lacking the grace of immortality but full of something rarer, conviction. He bowed not as a servant, nor as an equal, but as one who understood the weight of destiny. When their hands met, the crowd erupted in divine applause. The air filled with the fragrance of ambrosia and the brightness of celestial wine. Hera smiled with formal approval. Poseidon, Thetis's kin, looked away. Even Zeus, whose silence had decided the union, raised his cup to the pair. Yet amid all the brilliance, there was a stillness, a small, quiet pause in the music that no one noticed. It lingered for a heartbeat, then disappeared, swallowed by the laughter of the gods. But that silence was where the thread of fate began to twist. Slow, patient, impossible to unwind. From that silence, everything that would follow took root. The feast lasted through the day and into the edge of twilight. The sea reflected the colors of the heavens, silver, violet, and soft fire. On the horizon, dolphins leapt through the fading light, unaware that a divine story had just begun, one that would one day end in ashes and glory. At the height of the celebration, Thetis sat beside Peleus, her eyes calm but distant. Around her, the gods sang of joy and eternity. But the sea within her remembered something else. The truth that every tide must turn, that every calm carries the memory of a coming storm. It was said that she smiled once during the ceremony, but no one could tell whether it was joy or surrender. The bride of the sea and the king of men, a union arranged not by hearts, but by the machinery of prophecy. Even the air around them seemed aware of its role in something far larger than love. And then came the gift that would undo everything. At the edge of the feast, unnoticed at first, a figure appeared, uninvited, unwelcomed. Eris, goddess of discord, had come bearing a single apple of gold. Its surface gleamed with the reflection of every star, and upon it were carved 3 words that would echo through ages. To the fairest. She cast it among the guests and vanished. The apple rolled across the marble floor, slow and unhurried, like fate itself searching for the next pair of hands to hold it. Hera's eyes caught its shine. Athena's followed. Aphrodite smiled. The room grew still. The music faltered. And there, in that breath of silence, began the faintest tremor of what would one day become war. A war that would carry the name of Thetis's future son, Achilles. But in that moment, on the shimmering shore, none of this was known. The gods returned to laughter. The mortals returned to wine. The bride and groom, seated together beneath a canopy of stars, looked as if they belonged to the same world. The waves rose gently and fell again, as if applauding in rhythm. The night drew closer, its edges soft and forgiving. And for a little while, everything seemed still, a fragile, golden pause before the breaking of things. Thetis felt it first. The subtle pull beneath the surface, the quiet reminder that the sea never truly lets go of its own. She turned her head toward the water, and for a moment, the reflection of the stars seemed to ripple in answer. Peleus spoke softly beside her, words of gratitude, of awe, of hope. She listened, but her gaze remained on the horizon. Somewhere, beyond the reach of music and light, she could already sense the coming of another silence. The kind that waits beneath every celebration, the kind that no prophecy can prevent. And so, the night deepened. The waves sighed. The gods returned to Olympus, leaving behind their laughter and the echo of a promise. On the sand where Thetis had stood, the tide began to rise again, erasing the footprints of the divine. By morning, only the wind remained, whispering over the calm sea. And if one listened closely, it carried a single truth, that even the brightest union, when born from the will of the gods, carries within it the seed of its undoing. From that fateful union, the marriage of sea and mortal breath, a child was born, Achilles. The name was small and simple, but the sound of it carried sharpness, like sunlight caught on a blade. Even before he could speak, the air around him felt different. The waves seemed to move in rhythm with his heartbeat, and the light, when it touched his skin, lingered as if unsure whether he belonged to the world above or below. Thetis watched over him with a gaze that never rested. She had loved few things in her immortal life, but this fragile life that had come from her own body, stirred something beyond the reach of divinity. She feared not death itself, but the way fate often sought beauty and strength, as if to test their endurance. And so, when whispers reached her that her son's life would blaze bright and end too soon, she made a quiet vow. If the gods would not protect him, she would. Each night, when the world slept, the house by the sea glowed faintly, the shimmer of embers and water dancing together. Thetis held her child above the sacred flame, her hands steady, her eyes full of stormlight. Fire and salt hissed against one another, an ancient argument of elements. She whispered words older than language, hoping that the flame would burn away mortality without touching the boy's skin. The air smelled of smoke and brine. The infant did not cry. But fire, though divine, has its own boundaries. It purifies, but it also consumes. One night, Peleus, waking from uneasy dreams, saw his wife holding their child over the flame. He rushed forward, snatching the boy away. The ritual broke, the light collapsed into smoke. Thetis turned to him, not in anger, but in silence, her face pale with the knowledge that what had been interrupted could never be redone. By morning, she was gone. The sea had reclaimed her. Only the faint scent of salt lingered in the air, and the echo of waves that seemed to call a name no one dared to answer. Left behind, Peleus held his son, unburned, but changed. The child's body glowed faintly in the sunlight, as though the flame had not left, but moved inward, hiding beneath his skin. There was strength there, unnatural, restless, unmeasured. Peleus, both proud and afraid, knew he could not raise this child alone. And so he climbed the slopes of Mount Pelion to the place where the air smelled of pine and old wisdom, and entrusted the boy to Chiron. Chiron, the immortal centaur, had taught heroes before, men who would one day carve their names into myth. But when he looked upon Achilles, he saw something beyond even his long understanding. "This one," he said, touching the child's brow, "belongs to both sea and flame. He will not live long, but his name will outlive kingdoms." Under the mountain's quiet sky, Achilles grew, not among gods, but among creatures of patience. He learned the sound of roots under soil, the discipline of breath, and the art of listening to silence. Chiron taught him to use his strength without wasting it, to feel the pull of every muscle before the motion began. "The body," the old centaur said, "is the first forge. Before you wield a sword, learn to wield your breath." The boy obeyed. He ran with the wind, climbed the rocky cliffs until even the hawks grew tired of circling him, and sat for hours beside the river, watching the current carve its path without effort. His movements became clean, deliberate, and almost wordless, like the rhythm of a craftsman at work. Sometimes at dusk he would look toward the horizon, where the sea touched the sky. The air would carry a faint taste of salt, and something in his blood would stir. Chiron noticed, but said nothing. He knew that longing is a thread the fates themselves refuse to cut. Thetis, deep in the underwater halls, watched too. She could not speak to him, but she felt every breath he took as if the waves themselves rose and fell with his chest. Sometimes she sensed small signs, a glinting shell by the riverbank, a sudden current that whispered his name. She wanted him to remember not her face, but the feeling of being loved by something vast and unseen. Years passed. Achilles' limbs lengthened, his voice deepened, his strength became legend among those who trained with him. Yet he remained quiet, composed, a boy shaped as much by silence as by skill. He had the fire of his mother's will and the patience of his teacher's wisdom. There was light in him, but it was the steady kind, not the wild blaze that consumes. One morning, as dawn broke across the mountain, Chiron handed him a spear carved from ash. Its weight was perfect, balanced like breath before speech. "You are ready," the centaur said, "but remember, power that forgets stillness is already broken." Achilles nodded, though he did not yet understand the full weight of those words. At night, when the stars glimmered above the forest, he dreamed of the sea, endless, slow, and luminous. In his dreams, a woman's voice sang softly, neither sad nor joyful, only infinite. When he woke, the air was cool, and the waves far below whispered the same melody. As the years folded quietly upon one another, the boy became a young man. His presence carried the calm intensity of someone aware that time was both his ally and his enemy. Thetis's attempts to cheat destiny had failed, yet they had left him marked, not immortal, but unforgettable. He belonged to both worlds, yet neither could fully claim him. And so he lived in the narrow space between prophecy and breath, between love and duty, between the sea that had borne him and the fire that had nearly remade him. In the evenings when Chiron's forge burned low, Achilles would watch the glow of embers and listen to the slow hiss of cooling metal. He didn't yet know why it comforted him, the sound of fire surrendering to air. But one day, he would. Because in the rhythm of that dying flame lay the same truth that had shaped his life. That every act of creation carries a shadow, and every gift from the gods comes with a quiet cost. When the sea began to cool, it did not roar. It whispered, low, patient, certain. Along the quiet shore, where the tide drew thin silver lines across the sand, the ships waited. Their masts trembled lightly, catching the first breath of dawn. Achilles stood among them, his armor gleaming faintly, not as the blaze of conquest, but as the calm glow before a long departure. The metal seemed almost alive, breathing with the rhythm of the waves that had once carried his mother's voice. He said little that morning. The men around him spoke in short sentences, half-whispered, as though afraid that words might wake the winds too soon. The air was soft, full of salt and a faint sweetness that only mornings near the sea can hold. Someone tightened the ropes, someone checked the sails. Every movement felt deliberate, like a ritual learned long before memory. The young hero watched the horizon, that thin, bright line where the known ended and the unseen began. The armor on his shoulders carried the fire of the forge that had shaped it. Each plate bore the mark of a hammer that never lied, each edge tempered in silence. He remembered the rhythm of that work, the sound of metal cooling, the slow hiss of surrender, and for a moment he thought of the god who had made it. Perhaps Hephaestus too had known what it meant to send something away, to let creation step beyond its maker's reach. When Achilles moved, the light moved with him. The wind caught his hair, and for a fleeting second he looked less like a warrior and more like a reflection of the morning itself, fragile, bright, and destined to fade. Around him, the others murmured blessings, though none mentioned glory. Glory was a word that carried weight, and the sea was already heavy enough with it. He turned once toward the mountains of Pelion, where the mist still lingered. Somewhere beyond those slopes, Chiron was awake, listening to the rustle of trees that no longer held a pupil's laughter. The centaur had taught him that power meant stillness, that even fire must learn to rest. Achilles remembered this now as the sail above him filled slowly with wind. He did not smile, but his breath steadied, long, measured, as if drawing strength from the rhythm of the tide itself. The first wave struck the hull softly. The ship shuddered, then glided forward. One by one, the others followed, their prows carving through the pale water. The sound was not of war, but of leaving, a long exhale drawn from the world's lungs. From the cliffs, the villagers watched until the white shapes of the sails began to blur with the sky. The sea had claimed them again, as it always did. No trumpets, no shouts, only the creak of wood and the hum of ropes. Achilles stood at the bow, eyes fixed ahead, where the horizon shimmered like a question he had already answered. He knew what awaited, the clash of steel, the songs that would outlive him, the short season of brilliance that would burn his name into time. Yet for now, everything was still. The war existed only as a possibility, distant as thunder behind a hill. The wind rose gently, filling the sails with a deep, steady breath. It sounded almost human. The young warriors leaned against the railings, some closing their eyes, some tracing invisible charms over their hearts. Achilles said nothing. Inside him, something balanced perfectly between peace and inevitability. He thought of his mother, the sea goddess who had tried to cheat death with flame and water, and of his father, who had watched in silence as fate took its shape. Both had loved him, and both had known that love could not unmake prophecy. Above him, gulls circled lazily, their cries fading into distance. The world seemed to pause, as if granting him this final moment of stillness before the noise began. The air shimmered faintly, and the sunlight touched the bronze of his armor until it gleamed like a fragment of dawn torn from the sky. For an instant, he looked less like a man than an idea. The meeting of courage and fragility, the quiet defiance of someone who understood that beauty, too, was temporary. Behind him, the coastline softened, the sand grew small, the trees turned into a blur of green and shadow. The water deepened in color, from silver to blue, from blue to something darker, a hue that remembered every secret ever kept by the sea. Achilles stood there until even the faint outline of the mountains disappeared. Only then did he exhale. It was not sorrow, not fear, just release, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to hold back. The crew moved around him, silent but purposeful. Each man had his own thoughts, his own memories folded into the fabric of the sail. None spoke of home, none dared to. The voyage was a crossing of more than water. It was the passage between what they were and what they would soon become. Toward midday, the sun climbed higher, scattering its warmth over the decks. Achilles lifted his hand to shield his eyes. The light flashed across his knuckles, the same hand once held by a mother who tried to protect what even the gods could not. He smiled faintly, though no one saw it. There was peace in surrendering to what could not be undone. By evening, the ships had merged with the horizon. The sea was calm again, untroubled by what it carried. On the shore, the footprints left behind by the departing warriors had already begun to fade. Waves rolled over them, slow and patient, erasing the trace of movement, leaving only smooth sand and the whisper of foam. When night came, the stars spread across the water like scattered embers. The world above and the world below mirrored each other. Sky and sea, fate and choice, both endless, both indifferent. Somewhere within that reflection, the sails drifted on, pale and soundless, carrying the promise of a story that had not yet been told. And the shore, left behind, grew silent once more, as it had been at the beginning, the quiet breathing of earth after farewell. Epilogue: The Wheel still turns. 4 stories meet at a single, unhurried understanding. Some things descend and never return, some leave for half a year, then come back. Some remain quietly in the work shaped by steady hands, and some simply pass like a streak of light across the dark. The night arranges them neatly, a rhythm of down and up, of forge and tide, of breath drawn and breath released. Each sound fades into the next until nothing stands apart. The hammer rests, the sea quiets, the fields sleep. Somewhere the faint hum of a fan replaces the voices, the wind, the crackle of fire. What remains is only the slow pulse of time, patient, circular, unending. The stories do not close, they settle like dust over cooled metal, like silt beneath calm water. If you are still awake, let the last echo drift and fold into the dark. Breathe in a little deeper. Breathe out a little longer. The night keeps its rhythm. The world continues turning. And everything that once burned, bloomed, or broke now rests in the same silence, waiting softly for the next beginning.